Power is easy to abuse when you think no one in the room can challenge you. The courtroom in downtown Baltimore was quiet except for the low shuffle of papers and the distant hum of traffic drifting through the tall windows. Morning light stretched across the polished wooden floor, touching the rows of benches where a handful of observers sat watching the proceedings. At the front of the room, Judge Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses and reviewed the file in front of him, his expression calm but tired in the way judges often look after decades behind the bench. Near the witness stand stood Officer Daniel Whitmore, a tall patrol officer in a crisp Navy uniform, his badge catching the light every time he shifted his shoulders. Whitmore had the kind of confidence that came from wearing authority every day, the kind that made his voice louder than necessary and his patience thinner than it should have been. Across from him stood a woman who looked almost invisible to the room at first glance. Her name was Monica Carter. She wore a simple dark blazer and held a small leather folder close to her side, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes steady as she listened. Whitmore studied her for a moment with the faint smirk of someone who believed he already understood the situation. Then he leaned slightly toward the railings separating them and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "You expect this court to believe your version of events?" he asked, his tone sharp with skepticism. A few heads in the gallery lifted. The comment hung in the air longer than necessary. Monica Carter didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply looked at him, calm and quiet in a way that somehow made the room feel smaller. Whitmore mistook that silence for weakness. He took another step forward, resting his hand against the rail with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Let me make something clear," he continued, glancing briefly toward the judge before looking back at her. "People walk into court every day with stories. That doesn't make them true." A faint murmur moved through the back row before quickly fading. Judge Bennett lifted his eyes from the file, clearly sensing the tension beginning to build. "Officer Whitmore," the judge said evenly, "keep your comments focused on the testimony." Whitmore nodded, but the tight expression on his face suggested he had no intention of backing down. Across the room, a young court clerk quietly organized paperwork on a nearby desk. When he glanced up toward Monica Carter, his hands suddenly froze for a split second, as if he had just recognized something he couldn't quite believe. His eyes flicked between her face and the small folder she carried. Meanwhile, Whitmore continued speaking, unaware of the subtle shift happening around him. "You know what I see here?" he said, gesturing lightly toward Monica. "Someone hoping the system will just take her word for it." His voice carried through the room with the confidence of someone who believed the badge on his chest placed him above question. Monica Carter remained still. She watched him carefully, almost thoughtfully, as though she were studying more than just his words. The judge tapped his pen once against the bench, signaling patience was beginning to wear thin. But Whitmore kept going, convinced he controlled the moment. What Officer Daniel Whitmore didn't realize was that in less than 10 minutes, the quiet woman standing in front of him would place a single identification card on that courtroom table, and the entire room would understand that the balance of power had never been what he thought it was. The silence that followed Officer Whitmore's last remark lingered in the courtroom like a thin layer of tension resting over every wooden bench and polished surface. Judge Harold Bennett slowly lifted his eyes again, studying the exchange with the careful patience of someone who had seen thousands of cases pass through the same room over the last 20 years. The judge had learned something about human behavior during those years. People often revealed their character not when they were challenged, but when they believed they had complete control. Officer Daniel Whitmore clearly believed he had control. He straightened his uniform slightly and glanced toward the gallery, almost as if he expected quiet agreement from the handful of observers sitting behind the railing. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Across from him, Monica Carter remained exactly where she had been standing moments earlier, calm and composed, her hands resting lightly on the leather folder she carried. Her expression had not changed. If anything, her silence seemed to make Whitmore more impatient. He took another slow breath and shook his head with a faint chuckle that carried across the room. "It is interesting," he said, his voice steady but edged with quiet judgment, "how often people walk into a courtroom and expect the law to simply trust whatever they say." Judge Bennett set his pen down on the bench with a soft tap. "Officer Whitmore," the judge said carefully, This court is interested in facts, not commentary. Whitmore nodded again, but his eyes returned immediately to Monica Carter. The tension between them had begun to draw the attention of everyone present. Even the bailiff near the courtroom door watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. Whitmore leaned slightly closer to the witness stand railing, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let me ask you something simple," he said. "Do you understand how serious it is to stand in a courtroom and make claims that cannot be verified?" The words carried a subtle accusation beneath their surface. Monica Carter finally moved, but only slightly. She adjusted her stance and met Whitmore's gaze with the same steady calm she had shown from the moment she entered the room. "I understand the importance of the truth," she replied quietly. Her voice was even and measured, the kind of voice that did not rise under pressure. Something about that calm response seemed to irritate Whitmore more than open disagreement would have. He exhaled slowly and looked toward the judge again. "Your Honor," he said. "With respect, situations like this are exactly why officers are asked to verify information before it wastes the court's time." In the corner of the room, the young court clerk who had frozen earlier was now staring openly at Monica Carter. The recognition in his eyes was no longer uncertain. His hand hovered above a stack of documents as if he had forgotten what he had been doing entirely. He leaned closer to another clerk seated beside him and whispered something that caused the second clerk to glance up quickly toward the witness stand. Neither of them spoke again, but the energy between them shifted instantly. Meanwhile, Officer Whitmore continued speaking, unaware of the subtle reactions unfolding behind him. "You see," he continued, gesturing lightly with his hand, "when officers spend years dealing with situations like this, they learn to recognize patterns." The statement floated across the room with the quiet weight of assumption. Monica Carter did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression thoughtful, as if she were giving him every opportunity to finish what he believed needed to be said. Judge Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair, studying both of them now with deeper interest. The courtroom had grown noticeably still. Even the distant sounds of traffic outside seemed to fade into the background. What Officer Whitmore could not see was the look that passed between the two court clerks near the desk. One of them quietly reached toward the telephone beside the paperwork, hesitating for only a moment before lifting the receiver. Because somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, someone very important was about to learn exactly how Officer Daniel Whitmore had chosen to use his authority that morning. The soft murmur of the telephone being lifted barely carried across the courtroom, but it marked the beginning of a shift that Officer Daniel Whitmore could not yet see. He remained focused on the woman standing calmly in front of him, convinced that the situation was exactly what he believed it to be. Outside the tall windows, the morning sun had climbed higher above the Baltimore skyline, casting longer beams of light across the courtroom floor. Dust moved slowly through the air like tiny sparks drifting through the quiet room. Judge Harold Bennett folded his hands together on the bench and watched carefully, saying nothing for the moment. Years on the bench had taught him that moments like this often revealed more than testimony ever could. Officer Whitmore straightened his posture again and took a slow breath, clearly confident that his words were guiding the direction of the room. "Let us make this simple," he said, his tone measured but firm. "If someone wants the court to believe their claims, they should be prepared to support them." He looked directly at Monica Carter as he spoke, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for any sign that she might be uncertain. But Monica Carter remained steady. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her breathing was calm. The leather folder she held rested lightly against the railing, untouched. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet clarity it had before. "The truth does not always need to raise its voice," she said. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with surprising weight. One of the observers in the back row shifted in his seat, glancing briefly toward the court clerk's desk. At that desk, the young clerk who had recognized Monica Carter was now speaking in a hushed voice into the telephone receiver. His expression had changed completely. Earlier he had looked confused. Now he looked deeply concerned. The second clerk beside him kept glancing toward Officer Whitmore, then back toward the phone, clearly aware that something important was unfolding beyond the officer's understanding. Meanwhile, Whitmore continued, unaware of the growing tension spreading quietly through the room. "Confidence is not the same thing as credibility," he said, tapping his fingers lightly against the railing. Courts require evidence. Monica Carter nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement rather than resisting it. That is correct, she replied. The agreement seemed to catch Whitmore slightly off guard for a moment, but he recovered quickly, interpreting her calm response as further proof that he controlled the situation. Judge Bennett studied both of them closely now, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sensed the undercurrent moving beneath the conversation. Officer Whitmore, the judge said carefully, the court will determine credibility. Your role here is to provide information, not conclusions. Whitmore inclined his head politely toward the bench, but the confidence in his expression remained unchanged. He believed the facts were clearly on his side. Across the room, the clerk slowly lowered the telephone receiver back onto its cradle. He swallowed once and exchanged another glance with his coworker. Neither of them spoke out loud, but the tension between them had become unmistakable. Something had just been confirmed on the other end of that call. The young clerk straightened the stack of documents in front of him and then looked once more toward Monica Carter with quiet respect. Meanwhile, Officer Whitmore shifted his stance and continued speaking as though nothing around him had changed. Situations like this are exactly why officers are trained to question inconsistencies, he explained. We cannot simply accept every statement placed in front of us. The room had grown very still again. Even the judge seemed to be waiting now. And standing calmly in the center of it all, Monica Carter finally reached down and placed her hand gently on the leather folder she had carried into the courtroom from the very beginning. She did not open it yet. She simply rested her fingers there, as though preparing for a moment that Officer Daniel Whitmore still believed belonged entirely to him. The quiet in the courtroom grew heavier as Monica Carter's fingers rested on the leather folder, the simple gesture almost unnoticed by most of the people in the room, but somehow carrying a quiet sense of inevitability. Officer Daniel Whitmore watched her with a look that mixed impatience and certainty, convinced that whatever she planned to show could not possibly change the direction of the moment. He shifted his weight slightly and folded his arms across his chest, the polished badge on his uniform catching the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows behind the judge's bench. If you have something to present, Whitmore said after a moment, his voice calm but edged with challenge, this would be the time. Judge Harold Bennett glanced briefly toward Monica Carter as well, his expression thoughtful. The judge had begun to sense that something important was about to unfold, though he had not yet seen the full picture. Around the room, the small group of observers leaned forward slightly without realizing it, drawn into the quiet tension that had slowly filled the courtroom over the past several minutes. At the clerk's desk, the young clerk who had made the phone call sat unusually still now, his hands folded on top of a stack of documents. He had stopped writing entirely. His co-worker beside him kept glancing toward the courtroom doors as if expecting someone to walk through them at any moment. None of this had registered with Officer Whitmore. His attention remained fixed on Monica Carter. To him, the situation still looked exactly the same as it had when the hearing began. An officer standing confidently in uniform and a quiet woman making claims that he believed could not stand under scrutiny. Courts operate on clarity, Whitmore continued, his tone measured as though delivering a lesson. Without evidence, statements are simply opinions. Monica Carter listened carefully. She did not interrupt him. When he finished speaking, she nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the point he believed he had just proven. You are right about one thing, she said calmly. Her voice was steady, neither defensive nor confrontational. Evidence matters. The statement seemed to encourage Whitmore. He gave a faint nod, clearly satisfied that the conversation was moving in the direction he expected. Judge Bennett rested his chin lightly on his hand, studying the exchange with growing interest. Monica Carter finally lifted the leather folder and placed it gently on the narrow wooden surface in front of her. The soft sound of it touching the rail echoed more loudly than it should have in the quiet room. She did not open it yet. Instead, she looked directly at Officer Whitmore for a long moment, her expression thoughtful but composed. It was the kind of calm that often appears when someone already knows how a situation will end. Whitmore noticed the look and frowned slightly, unsure why the air in the room suddenly felt different. Behind him, the courtroom doors shifted faintly as someone outside walked past in the hallway. The two clerks at the desk exchanged another glance. Something about the timing made the younger clerk sit up straighter in his chair. Meanwhile, Monica Carter slowly opened the folder in front of her. Inside were several documents, neatly arranged, along with a small identification card sealed inside a transparent sleeve. The card remained partly hidden for the moment, visible only to her. She lifted one sheet of paper from the folder and placed it flat on the railing, sliding it forward just enough for the judge to see the official letterhead printed across the top. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses as he examined the document. His eyes moved across the page once, then again more carefully. The subtle shift in his expression was almost impossible to detect unless someone was watching closely. Officer Whitmore noticed the movement and looked briefly toward the bench, confused by the judge's sudden focus. But before he could ask a question, Monica Carter calmly reached back into the folder and placed her hand over the small identification card that still rested inside. She did not lift it yet. She simply let her fingers rest on it for a moment, as though allowing the silence in the courtroom to grow just a little longer before the truth finally stepped into the light. The silence in the courtroom deepened as Monica Carter's hand remained resting on the small identification card inside the open folder. Judge Harold Bennett continued studying the document she had placed in front of him, his eyes moving carefully across the printed letterhead again, as if confirming what he was seeing. The change in his posture was subtle, but unmistakable. He leaned forward slightly, no longer relaxed in his chair. Officer Daniel Whitmore noticed the shift and frowned faintly. For the first time that morning, a small thread of uncertainty touched his confidence. He glanced toward the paper on the railing, but could not see the text clearly from where he stood. "Your Honor," Whitmore said, his voice measured. "Is there something relevant there that the court should address?" Judge Bennett did not answer immediately. He lifted his eyes from the document and looked directly at Monica Carter, studying her with a level of attention he had not shown before. The room remained completely quiet. Even the observers in the back rows seemed to sense that something important was unfolding in front of them. At the clerk's desk, the young clerk who had made the earlier phone call sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the folder in front of Monica Carter. He knew exactly what was inside it. His co-worker beside him had stopped pretending to organize papers and was now watching the exchange openly. Meanwhile, Officer Whitmore waited for the judge to respond, his arms still folded across his chest. The silence stretched longer than he expected. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke, his voice calm, but noticeably slower than before. "Officer Whitmore," the judge said, "I believe we may need a moment of clarification regarding the documents just presented." Whitmore straightened slightly. "Clarification of what, Your Honor?" he asked. The judge glanced once more at the official letterhead on the page before him. The seal printed at the top was unmistakable to anyone familiar with the structure of the department. "Ms. Carter," Judge Bennett said carefully, "would you like to explain the document you have submitted to the court?" Monica Carter nodded once. Her expression remained composed, almost thoughtful. She slowly lifted her hand from the identification card, but did not reveal it yet. Instead, she gestured lightly toward the document the judge was holding. "That letter was issued earlier this week," she said calmly. "It confirms a departmental transition that will take effect immediately." Officer Whitmore listened with a faint look of confusion. The statement sounded administrative, almost routine. Nothing about it seemed connected to the questioning that had been happening moments earlier. "A transition?" Whitmore repeated, raising an eyebrow slightly. "I am not sure how that relates to the matter currently before the court." "Monica." Carter looked at him steadily. There was no frustration in her eyes, only patience. "It relates directly," she replied quietly. Judge Bennett slowly set the document down on the bench in front of him, his fingers resting on the edge of the paper. His gaze moved once more between the officer and the woman standing across the rail. Around the room, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Even the bailiff near the door shifted his stance slightly, sensing that the direction of the hearing was about to change. Monica Carter finally reached back into the folder and lifted the small identification card from its sleeve. She held it between her fingers for a moment, allowing the light from the window to reflect faintly across its surface. The polished seal on the card caught the sunlight just enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. Officer Whitmore watched the movement with mild curiosity, still convinced that whatever she planned to show would not alter the authority he believed he held. But the young clerk at the desk already knew what was about to happen. He lowered his eyes briefly, almost as if bracing himself for the moment when the quiet balance of power inside that courtroom would shift in a way Officer Daniel Whitmore had never imagined. For a long moment, Monica Carter simply held the identification card between her fingers, allowing the quiet in the courtroom to stretch a few seconds longer. The light from the tall windows behind the bench reflected across the polished surface of the card, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the room. Judge Harold Bennett watched carefully, his expression now fully focused. Officer Daniel Whitmore, however, still looked only mildly curious. He had spent years wearing a badge, years standing in situations where his authority had rarely been questioned, and nothing in his experience suggested that the moment unfolding in front of him could possibly change that balance. If there is something relevant to the hearing, Whitmore said calmly, the court should probably see it. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who still believed he was guiding the conversation. Monica Carter nodded slightly, acknowledging the suggestion without any sign of tension. Then, with steady hands, she placed the identification card gently on the wooden rail between them and slid it forward just enough for the judge to see it. Clearly, the card stopped in the center of the space, the official seal now fully visible beneath the sunlight. Judge Bennett leaned forward and adjusted his glasses again, studying the card closely. The courtroom remained silent. His eyes moved across the printed lines once, then again more slowly. Something about the wording made him pause. He lifted the card carefully and examined the seal at the top, a seal that carried authority far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Officer Whitmore noticed the judge's sudden focus and frowned slightly. "Your Honor," he asked. Judge Bennett did not answer right away. Instead, he looked from the identification card to Monica Carter, then briefly toward Officer Whitmore. The shift in his expression was small but unmistakable. The judge was no longer merely curious. He was now completely certain of what he was seeing. Across the room, the two court clerks exchanged a quick glance. They had already known this moment was coming. The younger clerk slowly exhaled, as though releasing tension he had been holding since the moment he recognized Monica Carter earlier that morning. Meanwhile, Officer Whitmore remained unaware of the full meaning of the silence. "Is there a problem with the document?" he asked, his voice carrying a trace of impatience for the first time. Judge Bennett finally spoke, his tone careful and deliberate. "Officer Whitmore," he said slowly, "I believe you should take a moment to look at this." He turned the identification card so that it faced the officer. Whitmore stepped closer and leaned forward slightly to read it. At first his expression did not change. His eyes moved across the printed lines casually, the way someone reads an ordinary identification card. Then his gaze returned to the top of the card. The official departmental seal stood clearly above the printed title beneath it. His eyes moved downward again, more slowly this time. The words were unmistakable. Deputy Commissioner, Internal Affairs Division. Beneath the title was the name printed in clear bold letters. Monica Carter. For a brief second, the confident rhythm of Whitmore's breathing seemed to pause. The meaning of the card settled into the room with quiet finality. Standing directly across from him was not simply a witness. She was not an ordinary participant in the hearing. She was the newly appointed deputy commissioner responsible for overseeing internal investigations within the very department he served. In other words, she held direct authority over officers like him. Monica Carter met his gaze calmly as the realization formed. Her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Officer Whitmore," she said gently, "I believe you mentioned earlier that credibility matters in a courtroom." The words were not spoken with anger. They were spoken with quiet certainty. And in that moment, the balance of power that had shaped the entire conversation finally shifted in a way that no one in the room could ignore. For several seconds, Officer Daniel Whitmore did not move. The words printed on the identification card seemed to hold his attention in a way nothing else in the room could. Deputy Commissioner, Internal Affairs Division. Monica Carter. The polished badge on his own uniform suddenly felt heavier than it had only moments earlier. Across the railing, Monica Carter remained calm, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. She was not smiling. She was not angry. She simply watched the realization unfold in front of her. Around the courtroom, the silence became almost complete. Even the small sounds of shifting papers or quiet breathing seemed to fade into the background as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Judge Harold Bennett rested both hands on the bench, his fingers loosely interlocked, studying the officer with a quiet seriousness that had replaced the patience he had shown earlier. The judge had seen many unexpected moments in his courtroom, but this one carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Officer Whitmore slowly straightened his posture, still holding his gaze on the identification card. For the first time that morning, the confidence that had shaped his voice began to soften. He looked from the card to Monica Carter, then briefly toward the judge, as if searching for confirmation that what he had just read was real. "Deputy Commissioner," he said finally, the title sounding unfamiliar on his tongue. The words were not spoken loudly. They were spoken carefully, almost cautiously. Monica Carter gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Yes," she replied calmly. The simplicity of the answer seemed to echo through the room. Behind them, the two court clerks exchanged another quiet glance. The younger clerk lowered his eyes briefly, recognizing the moment for what it was. Only minutes earlier the officer had spoken with certainty about credibility and evidence. Now the evidence rested plainly in front of him. "Judge." Bennett lifted the identification card from the rail and placed it carefully beside the document Monica Carter had presented earlier. "Officer Whitmore," the judge said evenly, "it appears that Ms. Carter's role within the department may have direct relevance to the statements made in this courtroom today." Whitmore inhaled slowly, processing the situation piece by piece. His mind began retracing the last several minutes of conversation, each remark he had made now taking on a different meaning. The quiet challenge in his voice earlier, the assumptions he had spoken aloud, the confidence with which he had questioned her credibility. Standing across from him was not merely a witness. She was the newly appointed official responsible for evaluating conduct within the department itself. In other words, the person whose office reviewed the actions of officers when questions about professionalism or judgment arose. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like a slow shift in the air of the courtroom. Monica Carter finally spoke again, her voice steady and composed. "Officer Whitmore," she said, "this hearing was scheduled so that the facts surrounding the report filed last week could be reviewed clearly and respectfully." Her tone carried no accusation, only calm precision. Whitmore nodded faintly, though the movement was almost automatic. Across the room, the bailiff adjusted his stance near the door, his attention fully fixed on the exchange. The observers seated behind the rail remained silent, aware that they were witnessing a moment none of them had expected when they entered the courtroom that morning. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly once more. "The court will proceed with the understanding that all participants here deserve the same level of professional respect," he said. His words were directed toward the room, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. Monica Carter looked toward the judge and inclined her head politely. Then her eyes returned to Officer Whitmore, not with anger, but with a calm that made the message even clearer. Because the authority in the room had never truly been where he believed it was. And now everyone present could finally see it. The air in the courtroom felt different now, quieter but heavier, as if everyone present had suddenly become aware that the direction of the morning had changed. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood still for a moment longer, his eyes briefly returning to the identification card resting beside the document on the rail. The polished badge on his uniform still reflected the sunlight from the tall windows, but the certainty that had once accompanied it was no longer visible in his posture. Across from him, Monica Carter remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the open folder in front of her. She did not move to reclaim the identification card. She allowed it to remain where the judge had placed it, fully visible, its authority requiring no further explanation. Judge Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses once again and looked toward Officer Whitmore with a thoughtful expression that carried both patience and expectation. The judge had spent many years watching how people responded when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. In his experience, the most important moments in a courtroom were not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they were the quiet moments when a person realized that their assumptions had been wrong. Officer Whitmore slowly cleared his throat, the sound barely audible in the silent room. His mind continued retracing the conversation that had taken place earlier. The comments he had made, the certainty in his tone, the confidence with which he had questioned the credibility of the woman now standing across from him. What had seemed like routine questioning only minutes earlier now felt very different under the light of the truth. "Deputy Commissioner Carter," he said carefully, choosing each word with more attention than before. The title carried a new weight as it left his mouth. Monica Carter met his gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained since the beginning of the hearing. "Yes, Officer Whitmore," she replied gently. There was no trace of triumph in her voice. Only clarity. Behind them, the observers in the gallery remained silent, though several of them leaned slightly forward in their seats, sensing that the moment unfolding was about more than a single report or a single hearing. It was about the principle that authority must always be guided by responsibility. Judge Bennett rested his hands on the bench once more. "The court expects that all parties here proceed with professionalism," he said in an even tone. "This includes the manner in which questions are asked and the respect shown to each participant." The statement was simple, but its meaning settled clearly across the room. Officer Whitmore nodded slowly. The movement was small but deliberate. "Understood, Your Honor," he replied. Monica Carter watched him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "Officer Whitmore," she said calmly, "the Internal Affairs Division exists to ensure that every officer is supported by clear standards of conduct. That includes fairness, accuracy, and respect in every interaction, especially in spaces like this courtroom." Her words were not delivered as a warning. They sounded more like a reminder of the responsibilities that came with wearing a badge. The courtroom remained silent as the message settled in. Near the clerk's desk, the young clerk who had recognized her earlier allowed himself a small breath of relief. The tension that had filled the room for the past several minutes had finally begun to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding shared by everyone present. Officer Whitmore glanced once more at the identification card resting beside the document on the rail. The title printed on it seemed unmistakably clear now. Deputy Commissioner, Internal Affairs Division. He looked back at Monica Carter, his expression no longer defensive, but thoughtful, because the moment had revealed something larger than a simple misunderstanding. It had revealed the difference between holding authority and understanding the responsibility that comes with it. The courtroom remained quiet after Deputy Commissioner Monica Carter finished speaking, but the silence no longer carried tension. Instead, it carried clarity. Sunlight continued to stretch across the polished floor, touching the edges of the wooden benches and the rail where the identification card still rested beside the official document. Judge Harold Bennett looked across the room slowly, observing the faces of everyone present before returning his attention to the two people standing at the center of the moment. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood with a posture that had changed noticeably from the confidence he had displayed earlier in the hearing. His shoulders were still straight, his uniform still crisp, but his expression now carried something deeper than authority. It carried reflection. The realization that had settled over the last several minutes had quietly rearranged the way he viewed the situation that had unfolded in front of him. Judge Bennett spoke first, his voice calm and steady as always. "The purpose of this courtroom is to pursue clarity and fairness," he said. "Every person who stands here deserves the same respect, regardless of position." The statement echoed gently through the room. No one interrupted. Officer Whitmore gave a slow nod of acknowledgement. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. His voice was quieter now, more measured than before. Across the rail, Monica Carter remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the open folder that had started the entire shift in perspective. She glanced briefly toward the identification card, then back toward the officer. There was no hostility in her expression, only the calm focus of someone who understood that moments like this could shape the way people carried their responsibilities moving forward. "Officer Whitmore," she said evenly, "the responsibility that comes with a badge is not only about enforcing the law. It is also about how the law is represented to the public. Every interaction matters." Her words were not delivered as a reprimand. They sounded more like a principle spoken aloud for everyone in the room to hear. The small group of observers sitting in the gallery remained silent, but several of them exchanged thoughtful glances. The moment had become larger than the report that had brought them there. It had become a reminder about the meaning of professional conduct and dignity. Near the clerk's desk, the young clerk who had recognized Monica Carter earlier finally returned to organizing the paperwork in front of him, though he moved more slowly than usual, still aware that he had just witnessed something significant. Judge Bennett carefully slid the identification card back across the rail toward Monica Carter. "Deputy Commissioner," he said politely. She accepted the card, and placed it back inside the leather folder with the same calm motion she had shown from the beginning. Officer Whitmore watched the movement quietly before speaking again. "Deputy Commissioner Carter," he said, choosing his words with care, "I understand the point that has been made here today." Monica Carter met his gaze and nodded once, acknowledging the statement without pressing it further. Judge Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair, signaling that the most important moment of the hearing had already passed. The tension that once filled the room had faded completely. What remained was something quieter, but far more meaningful. A shared understanding that authority alone does not define justice. As the courtroom slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, one simple truth lingered in the air longer than any spoken argument. A badge may represent power, but respect is built by the way that power is carried. And on this morning, everyone in that courtroom had been reminded exactly what that difference looks like.